Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Samurai Shodown 2 for lots of different systems, although it was originally released for arcades in October of 1994, and what you're seeing in this is the Neo Geo version of the game. This is a 2D fighting game by SNK that, as I said, was originally released in 1994 for arcades, and later saw release across a wide variety of systems, starting with the Neo Geo, moving on to things like eventually PlayStation and Virtual Console, and now it's available through the Humble store, so I'll have a link in the video description box to where you can check that out if you're interested. But this game is interesting for a variety of reasons, the first of which being it's one of the earlier attempts at a weapon-based fighting game, of course the original Samurai Shodown being one of the very earliest, and it was released in a time when there was pretty intense competition between Capcom and SNK for fighting game dominance. So they were constantly trying to outdo one another, and it led to some really interesting and really great fighting games in the early to mid 90s, and even on through the rest of the 90s really. And a lot of people would even claim that Samurai Shodown 2 fits in among the best fighting games ever made. But let's go ahead and take a look at the game itself and judge it on its own merits, with a couple of stipulations, the first of which being that the footage you're seeing is actually stretched to fit a 16:9 aspect ratio, instead of being in the original 4:3 resolution. So if you're wondering why the footage seems like it might be elongated, that is why. It's not the way it actually is displayed. It's actually displayed in a much smaller window than that, and I tried to make it a more comfortable viewing experience for YouTube. Second thing being, I'm terrible at this game. Absolutely horrible at it. So don't expect anything remotely resembling masterful gameplay. I cannot pull off any of the super moves at all in this game. I can do it in the later games because they simplified it more, but I can't do it in this one. So, again, do not expect masterful gameplay here. I am not anything remotely resembling a good fighting game player. I am competent at best for most games. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and delve right into Samurai Shodown 2 and find out what it's all about. Now, as far as presentation goes, this is a 2D fighting game and everything is entirely in sprite work. And those sprites are actually pretty well detailed, and this game has a very nice art style going for it. It's bright, it's colorful, there's a lot of detail packed into all sorts of different things, down to even minute details like with things in the foreground. For example, you can slice statues apart and they'll actually slide apart, or you'll slice open a barrel at the dock and a bunch of fish will fall out of it and it'll just sit there for the remainder of the fight. Things like that, just these small details that are packed into there, along with this bright, colorful art style and these very well detailed sprites and animations, give the game a ton of charm. And as a result, it has aged extremely well. And speaking of details, there's one thing that Samurai Shodown has always done that really sets itself apart from most other fighting games, in that you can actually kill your opponent. By that I mean you can actually slice them in half and things like that. I mean, don't get me wrong, the game is not really gory or anything like that. You just slash them, their sprite slides apart, and they fade away. But it's one of those details that's just really satisfying, particularly after a hard-won victory where you're just down to the wire on time and health, and you finally manage to take the enemy down, and not only do you take them down, but you chop them in half. And the kind of weird thing about the way the earlier 2D Samurai Shodown games handled this particular bit is that they come across as oddly classy about it. It's not over-the-top bloody, it's not gory, it's not going for shock value, it's just kind of a thing, and it's like, here, there's a little bit of finality to your fights. And it's a pretty nice touch. Now, unfortunately, the sound design hasn't aged quite as well as the visuals, but instead of coming across as really dated, it just feels like it's limited by the technology of the time. The sound effects are all nice and punchy. They sound like you would pretty much expect a sort of anime-inspired fighting game based around swords and daggers and such like that to sound. The voice acting is all in Japanese, and it's done pretty well considering the time. I mean, let's face it, we don't really expect early fighting games to have particularly great voice acting. This one actually manages to do pretty well in that regard though, so kudos to SNK for that. And the music definitely sounds pretty unique among fighting games. When you hear a Samurai Shodown tune, you pretty much instantly recognize it as a Samurai Shodown tune. And it's all stuff that is very heavily inspired by the subject matter that it's actually portraying. So you get a lot of really traditional Japanese sounds mixed in with other things that are more modern, like, say, pop or rock sounds, as well as other influences that fit in more with the non-Japanese characters, like, for example, Charlotte. So they did a pretty good job with everything. It's just that the sound quality is, well, dated. It's limited by the tech of its time. Like I said, it hasn't aged quite as well as the visuals, because, let's face it, sound quality does not age as well as 2D pixel art does. But luckily, in this particular instance, the sound quality is high enough that it's pretty easy to forgive it. But ultimately, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is basically non-existent. Most 2D fighting games, and most fighting games in general up until really more recent times, didn't really have much in the way of storylines. And this one's really no exception. You get a basic intro cinematic that tells you little more than the time has passed since the events of the original Samurai Shodown, and that battles are inevitable to flare up again. And then it just kind of drops you into the game and has you fighting people for no real defined reasons until you finally get to the end boss, which is Mizuki, and she's just kind of this nebulous devil woman who is doing evil things because evil. At least that's what you get as far as the actual story that is told to you in-game. There's more to it than that if you were to look up information on the side, but the story's not really this game's strong suit. What its strong suit is gameplay. And what you get here is a 2D fighting game with 15 characters that is basically taking what the original Samurai Shodown did and improving upon it in pretty much every conceivable way. The characters that return from the original Samurai Shodown find their movesets expanded upon a bit, and the new characters fit right in with everything that's going on. Although you do get a few oddities here and there, like the character who is actually named Nicotine Caffeine. I'm not joking when I say that, that is literally the character's name, as well as characters like Chom Chom, who is the sister of Tom Tom from the original Samurai Shodown, and Ziger, whose weapon is a hilariously oversized gauntlet. And of course, all of the characters have their own moves, their own special abilities, and their own strengths and weaknesses. Some of them are stronger than others, some of them have shorter range than others, and you find that you will settle into certain characters more than others. For example, I tend to play more of Haomaru, Ukyo, and Genjiro, even though I'm pretty terrible with Ukyo in this game. I got a lot better with him later on in the series. And of course, you'll find that there are characters who you're not so good with. I mean, I'm not very good with any of the characters in particular. I just tend to main Haomaru, Ukyo, and Genjiro. But I'm especially terrible with Nakoruru, just because her attacks are all really short range and she doesn't hit very hard. And it's just something I never got used to, so I end up absolutely hating playing as her. And that has persisted throughout the entire Samurai Shodown series, in fact. Which I guess is kind of a shame because she's one of the biggest characters in the whole series. So, oh well, I guess. Regardless, the cast of characters is pretty well designed, and most of them have fairly unique looks and feels, so they definitely set themselves apart from other fighting games, particularly of the time, of course, because there wasn't really much else in the way of weapon-based fighting games at the time, but also even now that we've had years and years of other fighting games, many of which did include weapon-based fighting, so that is definitely well appreciated. And it's definitely given this game and the rest of the series some pretty good lasting appeal as far as character designs and such go. Now, as far as the gameplay itself goes, it's a pretty straightforward fighting game. You have light attacks and you have medium attacks that are done with the A and B buttons. Then you have the strong attacks, which you do by pressing both buttons simultaneously. You also have kicks that you can do, and you can roll or duck depending on movements of the stick, as well as do dash maneuvers. Obviously, with your various combinations of the stick movements and button presses, you're going to have a bunch of different special moves you can do. For example, the Kogetsuzan or the Senpu Retsuzan that Haomaru can do. And you'll notice that at the bottom of the screen there is a power meter. This is your rage meter that will gradually fill up as you take damage, and when you finally get to the maximum level, you do more damage with your strikes, as well as have the access to the super move, which, again, I've never been able to do any of them, but when you do manage to execute one, if it does connect, you will actually destroy the enemy's weapon, and they're pretty much defenseless. That is one of the kind of cool things about Samurai Shodown that is also really frustrating if you're on the receiving end of it. You can actually knock the enemy's weapon out of their hand if you do the right timing on your particular attacks or parries or something like that. Now, typically, in my experience, that means you get into a bind where you're both pressing against each other with your blades, and you're supposed to hammer your attack buttons until you manage to defeat the opponent by just sheer amount of button pressing, and then their weapon goes flying out of their hands, and they no longer have much of any defense against your blade. Now, of course, if they haven't hit you with the super move, you can run over and retrieve your weapon by running up to it and pressing the light attack button. You'll just pick it right back up. But if they've destroyed your weapon, then you're just screwed. And normally if they've hit you with the super move, you're already almost dead anyway, so there's basically no coming back from that. But it's still kind of humiliating when they destroy your weapon and then destroy you. Especially when you're like me and you've never actually managed to pull off any of the super moves. Even though they actually do display the input commands above the rage meter when you have it fully charged. It'll actually give you the command prompt that you need to do in order to execute the super move. I've just never been able to do it because it's a pretty long and complicated series of stick movements and button presses. So your mileage may vary on that, particularly if you're better at fighting games than me. I mean, that's not really that hard, but if you're better at fighting games than me, you'll probably be able to get a hell of a lot more out of Samurai Shodown 2. But you do have to keep in mind one really major thing about Samurai Shodown 2 and the rest of the Samurai Shodown series in general, apart from, well, Samurai Shodown Sen. And that is that Samurai Shodown 2 and the rest of the Samurai Shodown series in general, really, is really a completely different monster from something like, say, Street Fighter. Street Fighter is really more about speed and combos. This game is really more about getting a good solid hit in every once in a while, just so you're doing a lot of damage all at once, as opposed to just gradually building up a huge combo and just overwhelming your opponent with number of hits. This game really demands more precision and timing, and while you can do a few combos here and there, it's not really what the game is meant for. It's meant more for just some kind of slow, methodical fighting that, again, most people just really aren't used to. And your mileage may vary on that. For me, it's pretty fantastic. I mean, Samurai Shodown 2 is among my favorite fighting games, even though I'm absolutely horrible at it. It's not something I go back to often, but when I do go back to it, it still manages to be an extremely fun, well-polished experience. I mean, it doesn't really get much more well-polished than Samurai Shodown 2. But that's not to say it doesn't have issues. It does have a couple of issues here and there. Like I said, it can be really frustrating if you're on the receiving end of a really, really good player. It can also be really frustrating to deal with the game's AI because it's often complete BS in how good it is at beating you. And the final boss in particular has a lot of really cheap attacks. But if you're just playing this in versus, in the environment a fighting game is meant to be played in, which is 1v1 actual players, then it's an absolute blast. It's an absolute classic, and if you're a fighting game fan, you really owe it to yourself to play Samurai Shodown 2. Although, honestly, it's not my favorite game in the Samurai Shodown series. And it's through no fault of the game's own, really. It's just the fact that the later games in the series play pretty differently from the original two Samurai Shodown games. And it's to the point where you really do have a pretty even split between the people who prefer the originals and the people who prefer basically 3 on. I fall more into the latter category, so even though I enjoy the living hell out of Samurai Shodown 2 when it's not completely curb-stomping me, it's just that I simply prefer the later games in the series. But again, your mileage may vary on that. It's still well worth checking out, a fantastic fighting game in its own right, and one of the 2 best in the Samurai Shodown series, the other one being Samurai Shodown 4, which I really hope SNK puts up for sale in the same manner they put this one up, because, well, they only have Samurai Shodown 2 and Samurai Shodown 5 Special available in this manner, which, again, I'll have a link in the description box to where you can pick this up if you're interested. But it'd be nice to see the later games in the series, and of course the original as well, get released in a similar manner. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that. Until then, at least, we've got this and 5 Special available. Thanks for watching.